550-hectare site, the size of 800 football pitches. 100 departures a day, 54,000 aircraft movements a year. 7 kilometers northeast of Paris, Le Bourget is the leading business airport in Europe. But it also hosts the most important aeronautical show in the world, the largest aviation museum, and one of the most successful industrial hubs in Europe. Totally unknown to the general public, this airport has an exceptional history of more than a century of aviation.
It's one of the birthplaces of world aviation.
Le Bourget was one of the first airports in the world to carry passengers, at a time when aviation was in its infancy.
Flying was completely inaccessible to most people. It was a dream.
Le Bourget is a legendary airport which has shaped the history of the pioneers of aviation. The landing by the American pilot Charles Lindbergh after the first crossing from New York to Paris made it famous all over the world.
Obviously, this Atlantic crossing played an extraordinary role in the legend of Le Bourget.
It became the setting for every record and every feat.
It's an airfield upon which extraordinary things have happened.
But despite being a witness to numerous major historical events, on several occasions Le Bourget almost disappeared.
The Germans used Le Bourget to bomb England.
It was saved thanks to business aviation.
Through innovation, Le Bourget has always recovered. It has become indispensable to the largest manufacturers in the sector.
It's an unmissable event. Everyone is there.
Nearly $150 billion worth of contracts are signed here.
The Paris Air Show, a spectacular event that attracts 300,000 visitors a year from 48 different countries. It's still a reference point for world aeronautics.
We're able to get planes out of any situation.
We have always innovated. We're the custodians of numerous hundreds, thousands of patents.
A place of major importance in the French imagination, Le Bourget inspires aviation enthusiasts around the world. For the first time, this legendary but very secret place is opening its doors to us. Discover the extraordinary history of Le Bourget Airport. The Paris Air Show. This spectacular event attracts more than 300,000 enthusiasts. This is where the latest aeronautical innovations and aircraft are presented. Apart from this famous and well-publicized event, little is known about Le Bourget, but it's also an airport which operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a particularly little-known place. Unlike Roissy-Charles de Gaulle or Orly airports, there are no airliners here. Only private jets. In fact, Le Bourget is the largest business airport in Europe, with 3 runways and 8 terminals opening directly onto the tarmac. Every day, more than 100 planes take off from Le Bourget, taking businessmen and celebrities all over the world, in total discretion.
The way Le Bourget is built, as you're going through the airport, you can't see a thing. There are buildings in the front, and I think business aviation is very keen on discretion.
From business trips to official visits by heads of state, today Le Bourget is an indispensable airport in France and in Europe. An airport with an extraordinary destiny. A little over a century ago, what had been nothing more than a vast field became almost overnight one of the birthplaces of world aviation. Le Bourget Airport owes its existence to a dark chapter in French history, the First World War. In the summer of 1914, Europe plunged into a particularly deadly war of attrition. A conflict that employed the very latest in 20th century technologies, large-scale bombing and telecommunications. From the autumn of 1914, Paris had to be protected from the Germans. Experiments began with an invention that was less than 20 years old, but of which man had always dreamt: the aeroplane.
At the start of World War I, aviation at a military level was still in its infancy. Aviation itself was fairly recent. Before the war, it had more to do with sport, breaking records, leisure.
The history of aviation took a dramatic turn in September 1914, thanks to the Marne taxis requisitioned to protect Paris.
With the Marne taxi episode, which everyone knows about and which allowed Paris to slow down the German advance, what people are less aware of is that it was provoked by an aerial reconnaissance trip, during which the enemy was seen advancing. They said to themselves that planes, since a reconnaissance plane had been used, would be useful in protecting Paris.
Protection that involved several planes being ready to land and take off at a moment's notice. The idea of the first large military airbase had just been born.
They had to find a site that was large enough, well-placed, and also flat enough, with the ideal geographical and climatic conditions. And they found this place, which would actually allow them to fight the enemy for 4 years.
The perfect location was north of Paris, between the two small towns of Le Bourget and Douny. The site was immense, 200 hectares of fields, and ideally located, being both close to Paris and alongside the Route des Flandres.
Le Bourget in 1914, when this airfield was set up, didn't have concrete runways, air terminals, or a control tower. It was grass. There were hangars that could be dismantled. There were planes that were parked fairly randomly here and there, and more or less camouflaged, since obviously if the enemy spotted the airfield, it would try to destroy the planes. So it was made with odds and ends.
And yet, Le Bourget was already unlike any other place in the world. It was one of the first airfields to benefit from lights on the runways, and weather vanes telling the pilots which way the wind was blowing.
This may be incidental, but it was of the utmost importance because with weather vanes, the pilots knew in which direction they could land.
The war in the skies could begin. It was a revolution. Very young pilots flew in squadrons, shooting down the enemy planes in epic battles. And it was at Le Bourget that the nation's new heroes were born.
The pilots were always compared to knights, the knights of the sky. They were risking their lives every day.
Amongst these pioneers was Georges Guillemer, a captain in the French Air Force during the war. The man known as the Ace of Aces achieved no less than 53 victories with his planes. In 1916, he took off in a Spad 7, a legendary plane, which Le Bourget is unique in still conserving within its walls a century later. In the southern part of the airport, alongside one of the 3 runways, Le Bourget is home to the largest aviation museum in the world, the Air and Space Museum. 125,000 square meters open to the public, more than 400 legendary planes, an impressive collection made possible by the extraordinary size of the airport.
It's an extraordinary museum. It's the richest museum in the world because it's the repository of collections from the very beginning of aviation. And the beginning of aviation happened in France.
The Air and Space Museum is the only site in the world where so many legendary planes can be brought together side by side. Fighter planes, Canadair water bombers, 2 Concordes, an A380, but also dozens of prototypes with the most advanced technologies. And even life-size models of 2 Ariane rockets. Here, in this exceptional place, these spearheads of aeronautical technology sit side by side with pioneers, such as Georges Guillemer's famous Spad 7.
He flew this plane. He won a number of aerial victories in this plane in 1916, 1917. It was distinctive in that it had a machine gun that fired through the propeller.
All of Guillemer's planes bear the same lucky name, Vieux Charles, after his friend, a mechanic.
It's a very precious plane, which is very much linked to the history of the Air Force.
Genuine period planes are restored in the museum within the airport itself. It's one of the few places in the world to refurbish the first aircraft ever made, which were built of wood and canvas, extremely fragile materials.
These are very old pieces, and the aim is really that they'll last for a very long time. You can't use invasive products that might alter the object. You have to know the different materials. We have restorers here who work specifically with wood, or restorers who only work with metal.
These planes are priceless and are protected and restored with the greatest care.
It's like restoring a Rembrandt or the Mona Lisa. You're working with wood and painted canvas, so it's as if you were involved in restoring a piece of fine art.
A unique skill in France done entirely by hand. For the restoration of the Potez 25, a military aircraft, no less than 13 square meters of linen were required to cover the lower wing alone. Dozens of hours of work before the public can finally get to see this legendary aircraft. Le Bourget, a site with an exceptional heritage, at the heart of a fully operational airport.
It's a very surprising place. There are very few aviation museums in the world that are fortunate enough to have a connection with active runways. It's extremely rare.
When you visit the museum, there's always a plane taking off or landing.
Le Bourget has survived all the tragedies in its history. Despite the First World War, it has always stood firm and kept both its land and its planes. In 1918, Le Bourget Airport was on the verge of an incredible revolution. During the 4 years of fighting, the French Air Force had developed phenomenally.
At the end of World War I, it turned out that there were nearly 17,000 pilots who had been trained during the war. So they had a pool of pilots, and they had planes, which could obviously be used for something other than warfare. And so very soon, the first use they put them to at Le Bourget was carrying the mail.
After the delivery of mail came the first experiments with passenger transport. Le Bourget became the cradle of civil aviation.
Military planes became civilian planes. They were modified, the weapons were removed, and they were demilitarized to turn them into civilian aircraft that would transport freight to begin with, and then passengers.
In 1919, the first Paris-London route was opened. The journey was 3 times faster than by train. The return trip was very expensive, 600 francs, a month's salary for a worker. And the comfort was nothing like it is today.
It was very Spartan to begin with. Boarding took place on the runway. There weren't really any buildings. There was a kind of fence between the arrivals and departures.
These first passengers were also pioneers. They agreed to travel in particularly unpleasant conditions.
In the early 1920s, planes weren't very comfortable. It was cold inside the cabin, and there wasn't really any protection.
One thing that passengers complained about in the press was the lack of heating.
Women boarded in fur coats. The conditions were quite difficult. What's more, the journey time was fairly random, with landings that were pretty much improvised.
Despite everything, this means of transport was revolutionary, and Le Bourget became the place to go if you were rich and looking for thrills.
Taking a plane back then was a great adventure. And what's more, for a while during the first years of Le Bourget, there were going to be a huge amount of first flights.
People had their photographs taken in front of the iconic plane of the period, the Farman Goliath. From 1920, 5 routes would open at Le Bourget, bound for European capitals. Faced with this considerable success, the aerodrome was running out of space. Le Bourget experienced a decisive stage in its incredible history.
Between 1920 and 1924, various facilities and access ways were installed in order to accommodate the passengers.
In 1922, 5 immense Lossier hangars were built beside the runways, each capable of holding up to 6 airliners, the first of their kind. In In 1919, 700 passengers flew by plane. 10 years later, that number had increased to 45,000, 60 times more. With the incredible success of Le Bourget, France was at the forefront of international aviation.
It was fantastic for the public. Not many people took the plane. This was something new. It wasn't like the train, which had developed in the 19th century. Flying was completely inaccessible to most people, a dream.
But a very dangerous dream for the pilots.
Flying conditions were quite difficult. The pilots didn't have radios. Wireless telegraphy didn't appear in planes until much later. They had no radar. They navigated by sight. People set off without being sure they'd ever arrive.
Dangerous conditions that passengers would never accept today. Le Bourget has several flight simulators that are unique in France, specific to the safety requirements of business aviation. In front of one of the terminals, very close to the runways, the pilots are required to undergo training twice a year. They do this in state-of-the-art flight simulators. In this white cabin on hydraulic jacks, which is the exact reproduction of a cockpit. Private jet pilots have to master a specific challenge, knowing how to land on runways inaccessible to large airliners, as for example in Lugano, Switzerland, where the runway is in a valley between the mountains and particularly short.
Compared to landing on a runway with a normal angle, the flare has to be really pronounced, with maximum braking once you touch down.
At 1,415 meters in length, it's half as long as a standard runway, and the approach is much steeper. It's a maneuver that requires a huge amount of training.
Business jet pilots are tested every 6 months. If they fail the test, we have to retrain them. And if there are any real gaps, they can be stopped from flying. This isn't the case in any other profession. There's no other profession in the world in which the testing is so thorough.
In these simulators, pilots also practice coping with all the potential dangers of their flights, from the failure of one or more of their engines to lightning in the middle of the night. Today, thanks to the latest cutting-edge technologies, most of the dangers of a Paris-New York crossing can be controlled. But that wasn't always the case. Far from it. In the 1920s, Le Bourget was the largest French airport. It was here that the most famous pilots set new records. The history of aviation was written at Le Bourget.
Le Bourget is a legendary airport which has been visited by just about all the great names, Mermoz, Saint-Exupéry, Nungesser and Coast and Bellante, and an essential port of call for all the great pilots.
These seasoned aviators all shared one obsession: to travel the longest distance by air. The ultimate challenge was to reach New York, 6,000 kilometers non-stop. And it was from Le Bourget that the pilots could attempt the crossing. With limited capabilities, the planes of the time forced the bravest pilots to make risky choices.
Either a heavy plane laden with fuel or a light plane with a minimum of fuel. 2 pilots or just 1 pilot, or a radio, since they'd have wireless telegraphy.
At Le Bourget, 2 Frenchmen were preparing for this crazy crossing, Charles Nungesser and François Colly. They chose to leave together with a heavy plane. Heroic First World War pilots, they wanted to be the first in the world to achieve this feat. Their biplane, which they called the White Bird, took off on May 8, 1927 from Le Bourget. But what should have been a daring feat soon turned into a national tragedy.
They took off. They dropped their landing gear as planned, and then they got lost somewhere, certainly at sea. They were never found.
Their plane disappeared. The only part that remains of the White Bird is its landing gear, kept at Le Bourget. At the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, Charles Lindbergh, an American pilot, was preparing to make the same flight in the opposite direction, from New York to Paris, on board his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis.
Charles Lindbergh did something completely extraordinary, which is to say, he made choices that went against what everyone else was thinking at the time. One engine, all by himself. The minimum weight, he didn't even have a radio. He didn't take anything. He took 3 sandwiches. It was nothing, nothing, nothing. But he took fuel.
He accomplished the feat on the 21st of May 1927, just 2 weeks after the disappearance of Nungesser and Colli. After more than 33 hours of flying, Charles Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget in the middle of the night. The arrival of the American pilot on the runway left its mark on the history of aviation and enshrined Le Bourget in legend forever.
There were crazy scenes at Le Bourget because it represented so much that a lot of people were waiting for him. The floodlights were turned on so that he could see the runway, and he was pretty dazzled. He was also really exhausted. When he suddenly understood, when he saw the Eiffel Tower, he said, "I made it."
At the time at Le Bourget, the public could walk out onto the landing strips. That evening, hundreds of thousands of jubilant people surged towards Charles Lindbergh's plane.
The number isn't very precise. When you see the press coverage, it's either 50,000, 100,000 or 150,000. It's huge.
In the 1920s, taking a plane was still something extraordinary.
Lindbergh's achievement was historic. He was hailed as a hero throughout Europe, and his return to New York, the starting point of his incredible journey, was followed from afar. A major page had just been written in the history of aviation. Le Bourget carefully preserves the relics.
This is a very precious piece of canvas because it comes from Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis. When Lindbergh arrived at Le Bourget, the crowd grabbed hold of the plane and actually tore it apart to such an extent that the covering had to be completely redone. As a result, we have these pieces of canvas that testify to this absolutely legendary landing at Le Bourget. We're holding a piece of aviation history in our hands, which is obviously very precious and something that the Americans are certainly very envious of. The Paris-New York crossing had never been done before. It changed people's way of thinking. Suddenly the world was a much smaller place.
In 1927, the Paris-New York match was won by America. But thanks to this feat, from one day to the next, Le Bourget became the center of the world.
This Atlantic crossing played an extraordinary role in the legend of Le Bourget. For many people, Lindbergh and Le Bourget became linked. And then, 3 years later, in 1930, in the opposite direction, between Paris, Le Bourget and New York, Coste and Bellante managed to cross the Atlantic in the other direction, in the Point d'Interrogation, this amazing red plane that we have at the Air and Space Museum.
The 2 French pilots succeeded when Nungesser and Colli had failed, and finally got their revenge on Lindbergh. In fact, all of these great aviators were revolutionizing air travel. Thanks to their exploits, they opened the way for long-haul flights accessible to the general public.
By organizing races and achieving these journeys, they set up routes, because you create a map and then the routes fall into place. The route to Constantinople was opened up by a race, and then you have companies that start to operate these links.
It was once again from Le Bourget in 1932 that the other side of the world was finally reached by plane. The incredible journey from Le Bourget to Nouméa. The 3 crew members achieved the amazing feat of covering 24,000 kilometers in just 30 days with 18 stopovers.
To do what they did, under the conditions in which they did it, I find that it's beyond me. To me, it's beyond comprehension. It was an amazing time.
A mythical period. In just under 20 years, Le Bourget became the starting point for around 100 aerial feats.
It's one of the birthplaces of world aviation. It's a place in which some absolutely amazing things happened. So there's an incredible spirit here.
A century later, Le Bourget is still the site of extraordinary aeronautical events. Since 1953, the airport has hosted the Salon de l'Aéronautique et de l'Espace, the world-famous Paris Air Show. This is where the newest aircraft and the latest innovations are presented. In 2011, the Solar Impulse aeroplane landed at Le Bourget after a flight lasting 16 hours using solar energy. Whatever the era, the airport retains its place as the unique witness to all forms of progress.
Aviation is quite simply one of mankind's greatest dreams. Since Icarus, we've wanted to fly. That's what the Paris Air Show is all about.
Even the most surprising inventions are presented here. In 1957, an experimental device took off vertically in front of a stunned audience. It was the Flying Attar, a metal cylinder powered by a turbojet. At Le Bourget, they try to imagine the aviation of the future.
Nothing that happens in development can be part of the world of aviation if it hasn't been validated in some way at the Paris Air Show. All of the big planes, all of the new products, the innovations go to Le Bourget. For the manufacturers, it's a place that's absolutely essential for presenting new innovations. It's like baptizing a child. You're bringing your beautiful new plane to the Paris Air Show.
Among these innovations, some planes have never flown anywhere else than in front of this audience. Like the Baroudeur, a prototype fighter plane capable of landing on any terrain without the conventional landing gear. Since its inception, the Paris Air Show has been a strategic meeting place for professionals in the aviation sector.
You get to meet all the clients, all the aircraft manufacturers, all the engine manufacturers, all the equipment manufacturers. It's a party. But it's a big business party. It's an unmissable event. Everyone is there.
Manufacturers present their latest innovations there. It's such an important show that it can also prove risky in the face of industrial espionage.
If we were to put the real engines on display, you might get people scratching them with a small coin or a sharp object of some kind when no one was looking to see what they were made of. That's why we only have models.
But behind the good-natured, festive atmosphere at the show, in reality, these aeronautical players are gambling with their futures. The biggest contracts in the sector are signed with great pomp and ceremony at Le Bourget.
Professionals from all over the world, that's to say aircraft manufacturers, their equipment suppliers, the people who work for them, their subcontractors, as well as their customers, buyers, will find themselves in a kind of closed circuit inside the show. By the end of the show, nearly $150 billion worth of contracts will have been signed in just 1 week. It really is a very exceptional aviation festival.
Le Bourget, a major meeting place for manufacturers and aviation enthusiasts, or the starting point for legendary races. In every era, Le Bourget has participated in the most important events in the history of aviation. As in 1935, when Paris wanted a new terminal, the fate of Le Bourget changed once again. Just 15 years after it welcomed the very first passengers, Le Bourget experienced the most important revolution in its history. In 1935, the government made it an official Paris airport. But it very soon fell victim to its own success. The number of passengers passing through Le Bourget doubled in just 5 years, going from 40,000 in 1930 to 96,000 in 1935.
Paris was a big city, the capital of France, a great European capital, but the airport was getting too small.
It was an airport that needed a real structure in order to welcome passengers. But for many people, air travel was still fairly inaccessible.
In 1937, it was decided that a new terminal was needed. A colossal and extremely ambitious building project began.
They couldn't just design any old building for the moment when flying became possible for everyone. Flying has always been man's dream, so they needed an opening to the sky and to the dream that matched the prestige they wanted the airport to have.
The chosen architect, Georges Labro, had a totally avant-garde idea for the time: to build a single edifice in place of all the buildings that were previously scattered around the site, on the model of a large railway station.
Georges Labro designed a rectilinear terminal, a large building that was 233 meters long and 30 meters wide, within which he had decided that everything would be placed.
It was a world first because it brought all of the functions related to civil aviation together in the same building.
In this majestic setting, there was a huge central reception hall called the Salle des Huit Colonnes to welcome the passengers. On the ceiling, there were 3 glass-tiled vaults for maximum brightness inside. Completely innovative for the time, their support structure was concealed on the outside. Departure and arrival signs directed passengers towards the tarmac or the exit. The dream had come true. The Paris airport was born, and air travel promised to replace the great sea crossings.
The architecture is really very interesting because it makes you think of a boat. It's an ocean liner.
It must be said that at the time, people still spoke of Le Bourget as an airport. He made an ocean liner, so there was this big building that looked like a big ship, with terraces that provided a view of all the runways.
The public was invited to come to these terraces on Sundays and watch the planes taking off from close range. It was a way to introduce as many people as possible to flying.
That's really what it was for. It was done to promote flying so that all the people who were there could have access to this dream. We'd so longed to tear ourselves away from the ground, to find a way to rise up, a form of elevation, a joy of flying that was accessible to all.
In the 1930s, aviation was still very impressive. A plane taking off, a plane with propellers, brought in the crowds.
This completely innovative new airport was a tremendous success. In 1938, just 1 year after its construction, nearly 140,000 passengers passed through Le Bourget.
Why did they make something so grandiose? It's because there was still this idea of having an airport worthy of the name for Paris.
Le Bourget was the most prestigious place in France. It's where people would arrive. It's where they'd set off from.
Everything possible was done to make the travelers comfortable.
At the time, especially after the opening of Labro's terminal, Le Bourget was one of the most modern aviation buildings in the world.
80 years after it was built, this terminal is still considered a masterpiece of the Art Deco period. The building now houses the Air and Space Museum. But for the last few years, it's been closed to the public because it's been completely renovated. It's a project on an unprecedented scale. With a budget of 21 million euros, 7 years of work has already gone into reopening this part of the museum. While outside on the runways, the architects have been working for 4 years.
We removed everything that had been a bit broken, a bit damaged, and we put things back roughly as they were. Some things have been electrified. The blinds, which were manual, are now electric. The windows have been double glazed for insulation.
The aim is that the public will even be able to access the terraces, as they did 80 years ago, and the control tower, providing an exceptional view of the tarmac.
The control tower. So, originally, this space was the control tower. From here, they were able to control all of the traffic. The mezzanine up there existed. We've renovated it. Looking through the window up above us, it was possible to see the planes arriving and to have a continuous view of them. You can see the Sacré-Cœur and the Eiffel Tower.
Ideally located, historically, Le Bourget has long remained the leading French airport.
This is the grand view of the museum, Labro's work. This is typical of what Labro designed.
The building is gradually regaining the sparkle that it had when it opened in 1937. This revolutionary terminal, which gave Le Bourget international prestige. However, just 2 years after its construction, disaster struck Le Bourget. In 1939, as Europe plunged into the Second World War, the airport was under threat. Passenger transport was halted from the start of the conflict. Being a state-of-the-art infrastructure, the airport was requisitioned by the Nazis.
It's an airport that was developed with cement runways. There was a strategic interest in this. During the occupation, the Germans used Le Bourget as an airport from which to bomb England. During the Battle of Britain, many planes set off from Le Bourget.
London is 350 kilometers from Paris as the crow flies. Adolf Hitler used Le Bourget Airport to carry out a large-scale operation against England. The objective? To destroy the Royal Air Force, the airports and production sites in order to invade the country.
The airport was occupied. It served as a barracks for high-ranking military personnel, so it was used. Hitler's bust was installed in the Salle des Huit Colonnes, in the historic entrance to the Labro terminal.
The airport experienced its darkest hours, such as June the 23rd, 1940, when the Führer landed at Le Bourget for a lightning tour of Paris. He'd come to admire the country he had just conquered, the day after the armistice had been signed between Germany and France. Following that, it was the Allies who bombed the site several times in order to torpedo the enemy. By the time the war was over, Le Bourget was in ruins.
As soon as Le Bourget had been liberated, and in the days that followed, the Americans started to restore an aerodrome. There are photos from the time, which was in a disastrous state. It had been bombed by the Allies. It had been destroyed and dynamited by the Germans. They tried to rebuild it in order to make another passenger airport. And who did they call on? They called upon Labro, who stepped in and restored his terminal.
The airport didn't reopen for business until 1946. Before that, at the end of the war, Le Bourget remained a military base, where hundreds of resistance fighters and prisoners of war who'd been detained in the concentration camps were received. For them, Le Bourget was their first contact with freedom. Amongst them, with his scarf and his elegant hat, one man in particular would play an important role in the history of Le Bourget. Marcel Dassault. He'd just returned from the Buchenwald camp in Germany, where he'd been imprisoned for 8 months. Hard to imagine that this brilliant aircraft designer would revolutionize Le Bourget Airport 15 years later. The airport had known some of the greatest and the darkest days in history. It survived the Second World War, and it even expanded. A third runway was built. The airport was at its height. 600,000 passengers a year flew from Le Bourget.
It was one of the most modern airspaces in France, and therefore it was still useful. And so it would continue to be used until the creation of Orly and Roissy.
The growth in air traffic was phenomenal. But Le Bourget could expand no further. It was therefore decided that a new airport would be opened in Orly, south of Paris.
In the aftermath of the war, Orly Airport was put into service. It was initially a military base that had been used before the Second World War. And then it became a passenger base, because it was much bigger than Le Bourget. So people said, this is the future. They'd been thinking about it before the war. When they inaugurated Le Bourget, they were already thinking about Orly. They knew very well that Le Bourget wouldn't be enough.
Orly very soon became the main airport for Paris and heralded the scheduled end of Le Bourget. In 1952, the nationalized company Air France left Le Bourget, where it had been born 20 years previously, and moved to the new airport, which was soon handling all the international flights. But with the constantly growing flow of passengers, these two airports were no longer enough. the decision was made to build a third Parisian airport, Roissy-Charles de Gaulle.
At the end of the 1960s, things were more or less established. They began work on Charles de Gaulle Airport in 1966. It was still called Paris Nord then. And then, at the end of the 1960s, things became pretty clear. It was going to close.
Despite a few regional flights, which still took off from Le Bourget, the airport seemed about to disappear. But just as the airport lost its main business, a new twist of fate meant it was about to be reborn once again. At the start of the 1960s, the airport's fortunes took an unexpected turn, thanks to a whole new activity that originated in the United States, business aviation. In fact, the transportation of businessmen and heads of state would literally save Le Bourget. And it was a Frenchman who would play a major role in the development of luxury aviation. Marcel Dassault, the man who had returned to Le Bourget 15 years earlier, after his release from the camps. In the 1960s, he created a prototype, the Mystère 20, a small twin-jet aircraft with excellent technical performance. But customers were still needed to enable it to take off. Once again, Le Bourget's past resurfaced thanks to a famous aviator.
It so happened that the American company Pan Am wanted to develop business aviation. They came, they sent a delegation to Bordeaux-Mérignac, and who was in the party? Charles Lindbergh.
Charles Lindbergh, the American pilot who had landed at Le Bourget 40 years earlier in 1927, after his historic crossing of the Atlantic, and who had made the airport famous around the world.
At that time, Lindbergh had become the aeronautical advisor to the boss of Pan Am, which was at the time the most powerful American airline in the world. And Lindbergh had to find him a business jet capable of carrying out missions for small numbers of passengers with the utmost efficiency.
He saw this plane. He liked it. And he sent a message right away to the president of the company, which said, "I found the plane. I found the bird."
By choosing the Mystère 20, the aircraft designed by Marcel Dassault, Charles Lindbergh gave Le Bourget an incredible boost. The large-scale marketing of private jets made in France began, but there was one small thing. The Americans demanded that the French plane's name was changed.
The Americans didn't like the name Mystère 20. Falcon was better. So the Falcon saga began thanks to Charles Lindbergh, who convinced Pan Am to buy Mystère 20 planes, which became Falcons. Business aviation established itself fairly quickly at Le Bourget. Business aviation was born. And by the end of the 1970s, business aviation had taken full possession of the airport. It was saved thanks to business aviation.
Thanks to this incredible twist of fate, a new era dawned for Le Bourget Airport. "40 years after the advent of private jets, Le Bourget Airport is entirely dedicated to business aviation, a service that has continued to grow on a global scale.
Business aviation is extremely important. There are almost as many business jets in the world as there are passenger planes.
Since the 1970s, Paris-Le Bourget has been the undisputed leader in this mode of transport. Today it's #1 in Europe, with 54,000 aircraft movements a year.
In business aviation, the main airports before us are in the United States, but it's the busiest in Europe.
And Le Bourget boasts something that's almost unique in the world. It's one of the few airports to offer a repair and maintenance centre for business aircraft, a technical commercial hub that's sought after all over the world. Right next to the runways, you can have your plane checked, repaired, or even fitted out. 3,000 repairs every year, 400 maintenance checks, and amongst those is the C check, a particularly demanding inspection.
This is the most spectacular check because we're going to remove a large part of the interior of the plane. The plane will be made completely accessible and will be able to carry out a pretty thorough inspection. We'll make repairs if necessary. We'll obviously do all the flight control settings. These are the critical points of the plane. We'll take advantage of these heavy inspections to make modifications to the interior of the aircraft if the client wishes. We can change the interior, change the color, change the materials, change the seats, or change the woodwork.
A bespoke service provided by the finest craftsmen. It's possible to have your private jet entirely refurbished here. And it's also at Le Bourget that you can buy your own private plane. There's a showroom dedicated to the sale of Falcons. A place that's little known to the general public, where you choose your jet down to the smallest detail. An investment of at least 50 million euros. This airport has always maintained a very high level of performance and aeronautical expertise.
Le Bourget is firmly rooted in the history of aviation, but it's also a platform that connects us to the future, because there are a large number of aviation businesses already established here, and maintenance centers and companies continue to come here and establish themselves at Le Bourget. So it's a place of welcome and of the future for aviation.
What saves this airport is that it's truly cutting edge. It could be very worthwhile to destroy this place. There's a lot of land, but it's ideally located, and each time it's managed to adapt. Each time it's been given a new purpose.
Always at the forefront of technological innovation, Le Bourget Airport has stood the test of time. To this day, the largest industrial companies still choose to locate themselves here. In the far north of the airport, the Airbus Helicopters Group has just set up a huge production plant. An exceptional building covering 60,000 square meters, the size of 8 football pitches. Only Le Bourget can boast both a site of this size close to Paris and links to active runways. Here, the latest technological innovations are used in the manufacture of key helicopter parts. 5,000 blades are manufactured and repaired here every year. The largest is 8 meters long and weighs 130 kilos, a real feat for this fully customized production site. Building a helicopter is an extremely complex task. In-flight failure is not an option. The requirements in the manufacture of aeronautical products are much higher than in any other field. For example, a high-resolution scan is performed of each blade produced in order to track down errors undetectable to the human eye. This robot, specially designed for this high-tech factory, checks in record time that the blade complies in every way with the engineer's design. The margin of error is tiny.
Thanks to this robot, this complex shape can be reconstituted in 5 seconds and then compared with the digital 3D model.
This groundbreaking factory is contributing to the industrial future of Le Bourget Airport.
Paris Le Bourget is a historic site for French aviation. We benefit from this motivation, from this cause, which asks us, which requires us to perform at our best.
The most futuristic means of transport are also dreamed up here, like the air taxis planned for a few years' time. With more than 100 companies established on its site and its world-beating aviation services, Le Bourget intends to stay at the forefront of progress. Le Bourget, the incredible birthplace of world aviation. From the first flying machines to the launch of futuristic prototypes, from World War I to the present day, Le Bourget Airport has been involved in the greatest aerial adventures. It has been frequented by the greatest pilots.
Le Bourget really has been a witness to the whole history of aviation. And the history of aviation is certainly a technical story. It's certainly an architectural story, but above all, it's a human story.
Today, it really is the only place in France that still remains from the period between the wars, from the period of the great pioneers, the great races, the first great scheduled passenger flights. It's the embodiment of all that.
It's the site of all the records, of all the exploits, of all the innovations.
You don't have to be a pilot to know about Le Bourget. Everyone has heard of the great races at Le Bourget. Everyone. Every little kid, even if they don't like planes, will have learned about it at some time or the other. Everyone knows about it.
Perhaps some new aeronautical activities will emerge that we don't know about yet. And you never know which companies might like to come back to provide regular commercial flights. The metro will be there. It's easy to imagine.
Always at the cutting edge, Le Bourget is setting itself new challenges. Work has begun on the metro that will serve the airport. And in 2024, the site will host the massive media village during the Olympic Games. A new chapter in the extraordinary destiny of one of the oldest operating airports in the world.